AQUABIZ, all the best knowledge for aquatic system.
Is that working? All right. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to say this is my first trip out of the U.S. for a while, but it's not. It's about my third. So it's nice to see everybody traveling again and actually see people in person. Allows you to ask questions and comment on things. So I'll talk through two different presentations today. The first one on the application of soy-based protein sources in shrimp feeds. On both these presentations, I'll have a few fish examples also. So if you've got questions on fish, happy to answer questions also on fish. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alan Davis. I'm with Auburn University. They're nutritionists. I've been there a couple years. Have a couple of my students here. Anyways, if you guys got questions after this, happy to answer them. If not, if I can get things working, we'll get started. I am. Maybe I'll come over there. There we go. So, as we all know, and we're nutritionists and whatnot, this is a lot of background. But our feeds are balanced to meet the nutritional requirements of the animals, or we hope they will be. But that's really tempered what's available in terms of both nutritional requirements, but in this kind of age right now, it's what ingredients can you get? And I know you guys have lots of challenges right now in terms of obtaining ingredients. So there's lots of interest in alternative ingredients. And if anybody has questions on things, again, we'd be happy to talk about them later on. And that's tempered by what is the cost, and then what are the potential ramifications in terms of using an ingredient, both nutritionally and politically. Ooh, that was quick. Let's back up. I don't know why we jumped. All right, there we go. But, as I said, there's lots of economic, marketing factors, social factors, some ingredients we can't use because the markets we're going to, so it's not always a straight choice in terms of what we're doing. But the ingredients we choose is a key factor in terms of, reducing our costs or improving our economic efficiency. So it's a very important decision. And, we've had this move for all my career to remove marine proteins and oils. Don't get me wrong. These are great ingredients. The problem is the cost and the level of ingredients that are out there. Everybody talks about soy as being an alternative ingredient or fish meal as a primary ingredient. And I don't think that's true in today's world. If you start looking at numbers, somewhere around 50 to 60 million metric tons of aquaculture feeds are out there right now. There's about 15 or more million metric tons of soy. That's about 25% inclusion across the board in all species of aquaculture. And there's only somewhere around 4.5 million metric tons of fish meal available in the aquaculture industry. There's about 6 million worldwide. 4.5 is used by aquaculture. That's only about 7.5 or 8% inclusion levels. So reality is, we've come down considerably in terms of the level that we're using it in our aquaculture diets. And to me, one of the things that is happening in the industry is that resources are becoming limiting, and if that's the broad term at least. But as resources become limiting, and that means that world food supply, sources of ingredients, that margin of extra has gotten smaller and smaller over the years. So that means we have to be much more efficient with what we have. Now, agriculture has always recycled ingredients, don't get me wrong. Soy, as solvent-extracted soybean meal is a byproduct, right? The soy is crushed for the oil industry, and then that's a high-quality byproduct. So we've been using byproducts all our lives. And you can see, if you look at soy, you're going to the byproducts or value-added products or whatever you want to call them. Or if you look at, fish processing, originally we threw half the fish away. Well, now we're capturing all those parts of that fish. We're recycling them. They're used as feed ingredients. This is what we've always done. We're just now getting a lot more efficient, and we're trying to use those ingredients that were very hard to capture. Now we're capturing them. But this is happening through the industry, a variety of ways. Or if you want to look at bacterial biomasses, use of insects, these are all ways that we can capture nutrients and use them to the best of our abilities. And that's happening throughout the industry. And I do a lot of talking and a lot of research on soy, and the simple reason I do that is if you look at protein sources out there, it's the biggest protein source out there, and consequently to me that makes sense for all of our aquaculture species to be using soy-based feed formulations. That's what the animal industry does. And I'm not going to spend time on this if anybody wants these papers. We started a long time ago in my career looking at soy-based shrimp feeds, and as far as I'm concerned, plant-based diets for shrimp work, close to, not 100% of the time, but close to 100% of the time. But we started a long time ago, and so had a long series of papers plant-based feeds, but we do work in the aquarium systems. To me, that's where real nutrition work can be done because you've isolated the animals. But we also do tank trials, where you can see both on farms and at our facility, where we'll do biofloc systems, we'll do green water systems towards industrial scale, and then we also do pilot scale research in our small pond. So we take it from the lab all the way through. And we've done a lot of work with soy, and back 20 some years ago started looking at replacing soy. And I'm not going to spend it, these are all papers that are out there, but basically initially we looked at a co-extruded product, which was a little bit of poultry meal and mostly soy, and we got great results with it. And that was really one of the first trials that we saw where we thought we could make a plant-based diet because that had almost no animal protein sources in it. But we went through a lot of different processes of replacing fish meal initially with poultry byproduct meal, which is a great source of replacing things. And then we took the poultry byproduct meal out, and then we went to all plant-based diets under a variety of different conditions, looked at different feed rates, we looked at different sources, finished that off with a review. So, products are, something that we can use in our feed formulations. It's very established. The poultry industry relies on it. A lot of animal industries rely on it. But there are, some problems with using soy. Just to list some of the anti-nutrients. And for me, this is pretty much overblown for a lot of the species that I work with. Don't get me wrong, these are there in soy and a lot of ingredients, but they don't cause major problems. A lot of times we blame problems on anti-nutrients when we really don't know what the problem is. To me, when we look at species, I think of them as a continuum. That there's animals that have low tolerance to plant-based ingredients, soy in particular, and this is mainly because of some of those anti-nutrients, or they have allergic responses. So for example, in our salmon and our trout, you can only have about 20% solvent-extracted soybean meal in the product. You can have other products, fermented or isolates, and go much higher, but in terms of solvent-extracted soy, about 20%, and then you start having enteritis problems. But even there, they know how to work around those problems. When we go to other species, a lot of these species we don't see enteritis in. These guys, because we see it in trout and salmon, we oftentimes think we're going to see it in other species. In my opinion, we don't see it in a lot of the species, in most of the species. But a lot of them, we don't really know the nutritional requirements, so we can have moderate levels, but we still rely on animal proteins in them. And then other species, shrimp, catfish, tilapia, carp, name your species, we can basically go to all plant-based ingredients because we understand the nutrition and they're relatively easy to work with. And so, as I said, I kind of think of it as a continuum of different species. No matter what, when we're doing this, we have to have good feed formulations. And to me, with shrimp, the biggest problem is our numbers for essential amino acids. I think we know some good numbers, but we don't have real established numbers for them. And then to me, the essential fatty acids and cholesterol are the next issues that we have. And we have very limited resources for essential fatty acids. We do have some bacterial biomasses, some algae meals. Now we have some genetically modified canolas that are on the market. So there are some alternatives for essential fatty acids that are coming on the market, but then cholesterol is still there. We still need a requirement for cholesterol, and where are we going to get that cheap source from? I think there's some products out there on the market that'll solve that also. But no matter what, we have to use quality ingredients. Whether or not it's a good quality solvent extracted soybean meal, or there's a lot of new genetic varieties, there's lots of different processing that can be done to make these better or to improve the performance of your animals, depending on the animal you're working with. Now remember, we had great summary of world production here a minute ago. We've got soy being produced in a lot of different countries, or even if you look at one country, just take the US, you have a range of environments and a range of things that soy is being produced. So remember that soy, when we talk about all of our ingredients, whether or not it's soybean meal or feather meal or meat and bone meal or whatever, we often talk about them as a product. But those are all sub-products that they are produced in different places. They are processed by different people. In the case of soybean meal, there's different genetic stocks. There are differences in climate, even within a country or across countries. Harvest conditions, we heard about droughts, right? Storage conditions, processing methods, all of these affect any given ingredient, and it applies to soy as well as to other ingredients. And we've done a lot of work looking at various soy sources to try and look at how some of these characteristics of soy do affect the performance of the animal. We've got a couple of papers out there on this, and this is just an example of about 25 different soy sources that were sourced. And again, they were sourced to try and give a range of qualities and a range of where they came from, so that we could look at the biochemical composition and then try and get back to, well, what in that biochemical composition affects performance. And so to me, one of the big take-homes was that raffinose is a big issue. The higher the levels of raffinose, and we've seen that across a lot of different studies with soy, the higher the levels of raffinose, the poorer performance. Now, remember, these are correlations, so some of these things are probably correlated things. Phosphorus, as an example, whether it's phytase phosphorus or just non-phytase phosphorus, correlated very well to improvement in digestibility. And that's probably correlated to the quality of the seed as opposed to purely phosphorus having an effect there. But we do see different things, and there are, levels of anti-nutritional factors, or in this particular case, a good example is raffinose. And there are breeds now where they've reduced the raffinose level, okay? And so that's potentially going to help improve our performance of our animals. If you look across countries, just as a generalization, U.S. soy is typically higher in nutrient content. Yes, U.S. soy is oftentimes more expensive than other countries, but it's more consistent. It typically has a higher nutrient profile, and if you look into feed formulations where they're actually looking at digestibility and the availability of nutrients for your formulations, they're actually more cost effective. And so in general, our U.S. soy is a much better source than other countries. Now we've done, as I said, a lot of work with different soy samples. So I pulled together an average of about 25 different samples of soy that we ran from different places, just to give a good average digestibility, protein digestibility, and amino acid digestibility. And you can see we've got very high, our typical digestibility is in the upper 80s, low 90s for protein digestibility for a high quality soybean meal. Now, of course, if you decrease the quality, you're going to have lower levels. And this is just a couple of examples. As I said, we've looked at genetics. We have the opportunity where we'll get a lot of companies coming to us prior to something going commercial to look at the potential. So we've looked at a lot of genetics for different soy sources that were in the works to whether or not they actually went out commercially. This is an example of some of those and some of the processing, just to show you some of the potential out there and that there are differences across soy sources. So this was both a combination of processing as well as different genetics. But just look at the protein content there. I've got it highlighted. You know, your traditional 48% protein, but we've got up to 56% protein now in some of these new soys that are bred for higher protein content. We also had some shifts in amino acid profiles, and as I said, the ultra low or low oligosaccharides are now on the market. I'll show you a little bit of data on that. We also see that through digestibility, and or growth rates, and then also digestibility, just to show differences in growth, difference in digestibility in terms of diets and the ingredients. So one of the meals that we looked at when it was still in genetics, in terms of looking at the quality of the product and whether or not they would move it forward. Of course, they got to look at the performance in the field, but also they weren't concerned with nutritional performance in animals, so poultry, aquaculture, and whatnot. But early on, we had looked at a product out of Schillinger Genetics, which was then bought out by Benson Hills, but they've actually moved that all the way into full production. And so last year, they started developing the value chain for that. So it's about a 40 or 58% protein soy, and we've got that in our lab right now that we're looking at it again. We've looked at a number of, and I'm just using these as examples, but we've got enzyme treated soy. So you can have your traditional solvent extracted soy. You can go to different processing after that. And so we have enzyme treated. We also have fermented soy that are out there on the market. Again, improving the quality of that soy depending on what you're looking for. So, you know, just quick in terms of fermentation, whether or not it's done commercially, whether or not it's done at the farm, whether or not it's done it yourself. But basically, you're looking at different funguses to take the carbohydrates, break them down so you can remove some of the fiber components, and also you're going to break down some of the protein, make it into shorter chain molecules. But it's done a variety of different ways. It's fairly popular in different places. There's, you know, a lot of times when we talk about fermented soy, people talk about that we've improved the protein content of the soy. And I agree and I disagree with that, and so I'll just try and explain that. Number one, when you do a fermentation, what you do is you've taken some of the carbohydrates out of that formulation. So the protein is naturally going to go up. That happens with any ingredient. You fraction out the carbohydrates, the protein goes up. There is a slight shift in amino acid profiles, but if you look at the amino acid profiles based on percentage of the protein, really what you've done is you just shifted the protein content up because you pulled some of the carbohydrates. But you can get, for example, lysine, some of the non-essential amino acids to shift. But for example, methionine, which oftentimes goes up as a percentage of the ingredient, it doesn't go up as a percentage of the protein. So be careful how you think about these things. But you generally do get an increase in digestibility and increase in protein. But most of that is due to just pulling out carbohydrates that were processed. There are a lot of potential benefits and functions. If you have an animal which has immune response to soy, so quite often you can remove that from the soy by going through a fermentation process. So in our trout and our salmon, where you have enteritis occurring, if you go through fermentation process, you don't see that as much. It's because of the processing and removal, lowering of anti-nutrients, or the production of some other compounds that are going to help with that. So we can produce some low molecular weight, as I said, break down some of the proteins. That has some potential benefits for gut health. You can improve the nutritional quality by, as I said, reducing fibrous enzymes. You also quite often produce phytase, which is going to release the phosphorus that make it more available. So there are some potential benefits for using soy that has been fermented. And there's not a huge amount of literature in terms of using it in fish. Rami, who's one of my students a few years back, did do a meta-analysis, but mostly the data that we found was on fish. But again, there is some nice analysis that's consolidating that. There's some out there on shrimp, but not a huge amount. So again, just to give you some examples, there's a lot of places where fermentation of soy is very popular and people like to use it. As I said, there are some advantages to using it in certain circumstances. It can be used as a feed ingredient, and then some farms will actually do on-farm fermentation and then use it there. I'm not a big fan of on-farm fermentation, but a lot of people do it. So, if you look at a lot of these studies looking at partial replacement, now in our case, we've done 100% replacement of fish meal with soy. We've been doing that for a long period of time. Other people have varying results in terms of studies, but these are some of the studies that they've looked at in terms of using fermentation. And as I said, one of the advantages is that you're breaking down a lot of those carbohydrates, particularly the fiber carbohydrates. You're also creating some phytase, and that phytase is breaking down phytate, releasing phosphorus and other things. So there's some advantages there. A lot of times they've been found to be good partial replacements. So when we've used fermented soy, we can't do 100% replacement when we're replacing soy. So there are some also disadvantages to using high levels of fermented products, and I think that's probably a palatability issue. But some examples, again, this was example of soybean meal, and this is a low-protein soybean meal. I'll like to point that out. And a lot of times when we're looking at these studies where we have these benefits, it's a low digestibility or a low protein ingredient, lower quality ingredient where we get the best bang for the buck, so to speak, when we go through a fermentation process. If you've got a very high quality ingredient to begin with and you ferment it, I don't think you get as much out of that. It's usually these lower quality ingredients. But they found benefits to using the fermented product. As I said, there's a couple of examples out there. There's not a huge amount of data out there in the literature. This is an example from our lab where we looked at, this was our local soybean meal, an enzyme treated soybean meal, a fermented soybean meal, and this is a soy protein concentrate, so that would be a fractionated soybean meal. And we're actually got running some different products than these in the lab right now. This was done with what I'd call is the America's genetics for shrimp. Now we have genetics actually from Thailand, from Robin McIntosh's group, and so there may be a little bit of difference, so we're running some redoing some trials like this right now. But this is looking at, again, to see if, as I said, I've used high levels of soy. We got 50% soy as a solvent extracted soy in the feed formulations, if these other products are going to perform better. So again, trypsin, just show you trypsin inhibitor to the protein content of those diets. And what we found, enzyme treated soy pretty much did the same thing in terms of growth. Fermented soybean meal. Now, when we've looked at fermented soy at lower levels, we found good results. But what we found when we go to these very high levels, we're talking 50-some% of the diet, we did get a decrease in performance. The same thing with soy protein concentrate. So this one we knew we would have a decrease. This one we figured we probably would. For soy protein concentrates, when we get up, and I don't have an answer to this, but when we get up to about 15% in a number of our fish species as well as shrimp species, and we've done this across numerous studies, and we see the same thing in this year's study where we're using soy protein concentrate again at high levels. When we go beyond that 15%, maybe up to 20%, we get a decrease in performance of the animal. So that was expected. But we've expected the fermented soy to do good. But as I said, we've seen this in fish and other species. And just remember, this is using it at a maximum inclusion levels. So decrease in performance. So again, there's others work out there in terms of the replacement of fish meal with fermented soy. And I don't mean to pick on anybody, but in our lab, and I've shown these diets as an example, so you need to use a little bit of caution when you interpret the results in the industry, is they're replacing fish meal with soybean meal, but they're also using a fair amount of crystalline amino acid supplements. And we've not had real good success with crystalline amino acid supplements, at least in my laboratory, for use with shrimp, and I don't recommend the use of crystalline amino acids in shrimp feed formulations. I balance my amino acid profiles with intact protein sources, and they did get a general decrease as they came up in soybean meal and then also with fermented soybean meal, but that correlates really nicely to the supplements of amino acids. So I think this is probably more a methionine deficiency than it's actually a response to the ingredients. And if they had included some corn protein concentrate or a high methionine source, they may not have seen that. And so it'd be nice to see this run again with a different source. Not a huge amount of data out there in terms of digestibility of these ingredients that we've been talking about. Quite often, and realize that when we're talking about these ingredients, a lot of we're talking about a high quality soy source, and then when we're talking about the fermented soy, they actually started off with a lower quality soy source. But in general, a lot of the studies have that our traditional soy, solvent extracted soy, and our enzyme treated soy are a little bit higher than the fermented soy. Although that fermented soy is improving the digestibility of that product that you're bringing it up. But again, a lot of times that's a lower quality product to begin with. And then traditional soy has been traditionally the same or equivalent to a little higher or equivalent to soy protein concentrate. So, these are specialized proteins that can be used. All of them actually can be used at a moderate level, but a few of them don't work very well at the higher levels. So, in terms of the advanced soy products, we see positive benefits. So the way I look at it is if you've got an animal that has enteritis, so you're limited on the amount of soy that you can include in your feed formulations, moving to an enzyme treated, a fractionated, or a fermented soy is a good thing. So you can go to higher levels, but remember your solvent extracted soy is your cheapest ingredient. Then as you do more processing, that cost per unit of protein is going to go up. And so I'm for using that least expensive ingredient whenever I can. But the fermented products, again, I'm speaking from the nutritional side, not from the health side. So those fermented products also have a lot of health benefits. If you're looking for an acidification of the feed, those fermented products help with acidification. If you're looking for a source of probiotics or prebiotics or small molecular compounds, a fermented product is going to bring that in there. And so, but again, that's at a cost. In general, we're going to improve the nutritional quality of the ingredients as we move to these modified soy sources. So as we use enzymes, we're going to increase digestibility. So if you look at a soy source that is not phytase treated, adding phytase or fermenting it, which is actually using phytase from the funguses, you get about a 5% increase in protein digestibility. So for species that you have sensitivity, all these more expensive products are very worth it in terms of including. So, the not so, as I said, positive benefits is basically the price. As you increase processing, you're always going to increase the price. So, as I said, for me, I want to use basically solvent extracted soy whenever I can because it's going to be the cheapest. And then if I need a higher protein content, if I need some sort of probiotic effect, then we can move to these others. Or if I have enteritis, if you're dealing with some of the marine fish or if you're dealing with some of our shrimp species. Now, we've been using a lot of acoustics in the laboratory as well as in the field now, so I want to share a little bit of that data with you because it answers some of the questions that we've been trying to answer in terms of what goes on with feed consumption. If you haven't seen one of these, this is an example of a shrimp. Basically, you can see his mandibles coming together, and you can see clicks that are correlated. There you go, click right there, that are correlated with it. And there's a very nice correlation between the noise that's produced and intake for a shrimp. And so it's a really neat tool. And we can use it to look at different processing factors. We can look at it and what affects species, and we can use it as feed management. We've been looking at, we're using it as feed management, but we're also looking at it in the laboratory because I think it's a cool toy for looking at some things. One of the things that's going on in the industry, somewhat in Asia, but I haven't been to Asia, so I can't say how much is going on here, but in Latin America it was a very big fad, still is a big fad, to use on-farm fermentation of part of their feed. And they would take soy, ferment it, basically make a farm-based pellet, and now some of them are doing commercial pellets and then fermenting that pellet. But what they were looking at the benefits is acidification of the digestive system for some of the disease problems, bacterial compounds because you're fermenting something, pre or probiotics. And I just simply had the interest from a nutritional standpoint. So I'm not talking about this from any of the health benefits, my question was, well, if you do this, what is the nutritional contribution? And so we looked at this in the laboratory. And one of the first questions was, would they eat a fermented soy better than they ate regular soy, or would they eat it the same amount as the feed? So we used both acoustics and traditional collections to look at that. So we fermented some soy in the laboratory, pelleted it, and then that same soy was also pelleted. And this is a timeline of the drop in energy over time for the different feeds. So you can either look at this acoustic response either as energy content or the number of clicks. It correlates both. But basically, the more energy means the more clicks you've made, and then also how fast it comes down gives you an idea of what's going on. But this is all real time. We're doing this over 30 minutes, and you're not disturbing the animal, so it's pretty cool in my book. But you can see, if you take that and put it as food consumption, there's our feed, and then here's our fermented soy, and here's our regular soy. So did they eat fermented soy a little bit better than they ate soy? I was surprised that they ate straight soy. But yeah, they ate it a little bit better. It wasn't statistically different, but they ate the feed, a lot better. So yeah, in the laboratory, we can confirm that they eat it. I don't think they eat it as well as a traditional feed. We then did a trial, and these are the same data. I'm just showing them two different ways. But this is the ration, so how much we fed. And what they're doing in Ecuador and other places is up to maybe 25% of the feed is being replaced with this fermented soy or grain pellet, whatever you want to call it. And so what we wanted to do is look at how much nutrition that contributed. So this was 25% of a ration, so we're really restricting the ration from feed. And then this was the response with just 25% of the ration as that fermented soy. And then this is 25% feed, 25% soy. Anyways, and it goes on and on. And if you look at it, here's our fermented soy on the bottom. There's no dose response. So, the most nutrition they're going to get out of that is somewhere down below this 25%. It didn't go up. So yes, do they grow on it? Yes. Now, when you take it and add it to the feed, so if it's actually going to be truly additive, then this line should have been exactly where that line is. So from the data that we've seen, the fermented soy adds about 1/3 the growth of a pellet. And so when you look at costs, if that fermented soy costs you 1/3 of your feed, it makes economic sense. Personally, I don't think it makes economic sense. Now, from a health standpoint, yes, maybe it makes some sense in some cases. But it was a big fad before, and it's come back as a fad, and so we wanted to get a little data on it. So we've been using the acoustics to look at the biggest complaint I get from plant-based feeds is they're not going to eat it. It doesn't taste good, right? You guys go home, you eat rice. Just rice, right? You don't put anything on it, right? You just eat the rice. No, it doesn't have a whole lot of taste, right? So we're used to thinking about plant-based things as not having a whole lot of flavor. Whether or not they do, I don't know. So we looked at some of our plant-based diets and then looked at different attractants. And the reason we were doing this is we liked the acoustics, and that was a neat way of looking at things. So I'm going to show you a little bit of that data. So this was fish hydrolysate, a krill meal, and a krill oil. These were made in the laboratory. And then we can do a growth trial, we can do a consumption trial, we can do the acoustics. So again, this is, we present the acoustics a number of different ways. We've changed our minds how to do that over the years. But anyways, this is a reverse of what I showed you earlier. So this is the cumulative of energy. But you can see that, for example, this line, which is the lowest in terms of cumulative energy, was our basal diet, and it was, in terms of consumption, significantly less than the rest. So this does show that we can have an effect on consumption in terms of when we add some of these attractants. But what we're finding is the matrix. So for example, if I do a poultry meal based or a fish meal based, that affects how they respond to the attractants. And so it's not a simple answer, you add this and you get the same results. The matrix actually affects how they respond to the different attractants. Some example of top coating. In this case, we used fish hydrolysate and krill oil. So we top coated a commercial plant-based diet. We actually looked at this 2 different sizes. Won't spend a lot of time on it, but again, 30 minutes or 15 minutes in terms of the energy content. And then here's our plots in terms of the consumption that we measured. We also did growth trials. In most of the growth trials, we didn't see differences in terms of performance, but we did see differences in terms of short-term consumption of these trials. Again, this was diets that we produced to look out all plant plus krill meal, all plant plus squid meal, all plant plus fish hydrolysate. Fish hydrolysate is about 50% water, so we were trying to hit solids that are similar in terms of the content on that. And these were commercially produced, so we ran them in the laboratory and we also ran them in the field. But in the lab, it's very nice to do the acoustics. You simply just, whatever tank you're going to want to use, you drop the recorders in it and you get a nice track of the recording. Actually, the hard part of this is taking the recordings and figuring out how much energy is there. But there's some software that can count the clicks and do that. And it's a nice tool for looking at intake. But we can correlate that to the actual intake. And just to show you that data, this is actual intakes of individuals in this experiment, and then there's the correlation with the actual clicks that we count from the sound or the energy. Both of them give you good results. But again, looking at, we did this with both native or naive shrimp, so they'd never seen these feeds before. They were on a commercial feed, then we switched them that day to the feeds that we were testing. Then we actually trained them for about 4 or 5 days, and then we gave it, and we called those the non-naive. But you can see that the all plant being the first one, we did get improvements in terms of consumption, at least short-term consumption on these diets in different sizes there. So we then took that out to our ponds to see if we could actually see this in the laboratory or from the lab all the way to our ponds. We've converted our facility to all acoustics, and the reason we did that is what we wanted to do is, again, everybody says you have a plant-based diet, they won't eat it if they're given the choice. Well, this acoustic technology actually allows the shrimp to make a decision on how much food that they will consume. Because what it does is it measures the sound produced, and then it feeds based on that sound produced. So our thought process was that we could let them decide, and then we could have data, in terms of kind of choice data. It's not as simple as that, believe me. But this is example, all plant diet, 8% poultry diet, 8% fish meal diet, 12% fish meal diet, and then we ran them through our ponds. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the data, but you can see our grams per week, our final weights, yields. In this case, there's absolutely no differences, and we've done this a number of times. We've done it where we've had fixed feeding, where we're managing the feed, and then this is for acoustics. And so the AQ1 is giving them whatever they want. And we found, no differences. Now this all plant diet, we then ran the next year, almost identical diet, but using the data that we'd found in the lab, we added krill meal, we added squid meal, which is typically used a lot of places, and then we also added the fish hydrolysate that we had good results. So this is very similar, different year, but the all plant-based diet is pretty much the same formulation as we had the year before. And then we just added our attractants. And these were extruded feeds. Again, this year we had a lot of issues. I've been there 22 years now. This was the wettest year that we've had. This is a quick plot of what our salinities was, but you can see we started out between 8 and 10%. Actually, it went up to 10% because there's evaporation. Then you can see it's just plummeting down because of rain. This is one of the first times that I've ever put seawater back in our ponds. Usually we don't do any water exchange, but our salinities were so low we actually went and got seawater to bring our salinity back up. We were actually doing all right. Got it up again, get ready for harvest there. You can see the salinity going up. About 2 weeks before harvest, we start flushing the ponds. And then we got hit by a tornado or a hurricane. You can see the salinity going right back down. So I'm going to show you the data, but it's not the best data. Our data up to harvest is all, pretty much 4 replicate ponds, okay? But then we got hit with the hurricane during harvest, and our pump that does the harvesting broke. So we pretty much got 2 whammies on that. And so our replication for final data, now our weight data is done weekly, so we have that data. But our final harvest data, this one, we only have 1 pond that survived. We lost anywhere from 25 to 50% of the shrimp because of the hurricane and issues associated with it for harvest, because all the ponds were down. Anyway, so there's limited replication. You can see all plant, we got 4, krill, we got 3 reps. Squid, we only have 1 rep, and the fish hydrolysates, we only have 2 reps. But the data is still interesting. The all plant in this particular case did not do as well in terms of performance, and I have to agree with that. I don't know if it's due to difference in ingredients. That same all plant diet, or very similar, has been run at least 5 times with no differences in terms of performance. But in this particular case, we did get decreases in performance. But then the fish hydrolysate, we fed a lot more feed into those systems than we did the others. If you look at the feed inputs and the performance just side by side, so you can see that real quick, the shrimp are over there, and the growth rates being predicted. We got a lot more feed going into with the fish hydrolysate, but we did not necessarily get a response. And if we look at the feed inputs, and this is a very messy graph, and believe me, we've pulled this data apart a lot of different ways. We've paired ponds based on biomass. We've paired ponds based on survivals. We've looked at it in a number of different ways. And the story's always the same, is that in our, the red is our all plant, and then squid meal also is in green, and those are lower in terms of feed inputs than the other 2. And the fish hydrolysate, for whatever reason, gave a much better signal. Now, whether or not it's because they're getting more excited and producing a bigger signal, or whether or not there was other reasons for that, but clearly the diets with the fish hydrolysates, those ponds, we received a higher signal on the AQ1s, which resulted in more feed going into those systems. So it does look like, you know, these attractants do affect the performance of the animals, and it can potentially affect some of these technologies that we're using for automatic feeding. In this case, the AQ1. Now, we run all of our pond-based diets also in our green water system. So we pump water from our ponds into these systems and run our trials parallel, because we don't lose these usually due to hurricanes and things like that. So the first 4 are a fixed feed rate. It's a standard feed rate, and you can see there's a little bit lower biomass because of the survival. So that plant-based diet, even in this system, did not perform quite as well. When we added the attractants, we got a little bit better performance. You can see that. And then these both were overfeeding. So that's what this 30% is. We added 30% extra feed to those tanks so that if there was an increase in consumption, and unfortunately we couldn't do it with all the treatments, we would have that feed for them to consume. And you can see the feed conversion dropped down. So we overfed these guys compared to these guys, but we did not get an increase in performance in terms of growth and whatnot. So in the tank-based systems, we didn't see a real response to those attractants. I mean, we did see a response to the attractants, but it wasn't necessarily seen as a huge overfeeding or overconsumption, we'll say. So, you know, to me, you know, no matter what ingredient matrix that you're using, what ingredients you have available to you, you got to make sure that you have good nutrition, that you're balancing the nutrient profiles to get that good performance. But there's lots of different ways that can be done, and everywhere in the world we have different availability of ingredients. So it's a question right now of what ingredients do you have available to use. The acoustics, I think it has a lot of neat applications. Latin America, particularly Ecuador, has adopted that technology. They've been very successful. If you've been watching their production has essentially doubled over the last 3 to 5 years. And that's due to them converting over to automatic feeders, and a lot of that being acoustics. There's well over 50% of the automatic feeders in Ecuador are acoustic feeders. And of course, the quality of soy proteins, there's lots of different ways in terms of defining that. But if you have an animal that has enteritis, or if you want to have some of the health benefits from some of the other products that are more expensive, then they're worth putting in there. The on-demand feeding, To me, automatic feeders are a huge benefit, or increasing the number of feedings is a huge benefit for what's going on. And I think that the automatic systems are a good way to start looking at some of these things where we can let the animal choose how much feed they are. So we're learning a lot playing with the automatic feeders. The attractants do seem to bring the shrimp in faster. I mean, one of the advantages of automatic feeder is the feed is in the water less time. And so if you can get your feed to be consumed quicker, that means there's less nutrients leaching out. That means there's less nutrients being lost. And so however you want to do that, through automatic feeding systems or through increasing attractability or palatability, I think those are all good things. And that's probably where we've seen a lot of advancements in terms of things. And of course, I don't do the work, my students do. So here's our previous group of students. I don't have a picture of our new students. And if anybody's got any questions, I've probably been talking to you for a good hour and you're probably half asleep. Time to wake up, ask questions, and we can take a break.